Next on our program, I'd like to introduce is the Blue Latitudes Foundation. The Blue Latitudes Foundation is kind of a newcomer to this long conversation, and we're delighted they're here. They do great work. And I want to introduce Amber Sparks, who is a marine conservation biologist, and she's co-president of Blue Latitude Foundation. Her work primarily focuses on seeking opportunities for ocean conservation at the intersection of industry and the environment. She has a BA from UC Berkeley and a MS from in biodiversity and conservation from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. In 2018, Amber was recognized on Forbes 30 Under 30 list in the energy sector for her work developing sustainable, creative, cost-effective solutions for the environmental issues that surround offshore energy industry. Amber is also a PADI certified diver and an ambassador diver. So I'd like to call Amber up. I saw her. There you are. Thank you. Hi,
thank you. This will be just fine. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Gary and Michelle, for welcoming us here today. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Amber Sparks. I'm a marine conservation biologist and co-founder of the Blue Latitudes Foundation. We're a nonprofit 501c3 here in California that's working to find opportunities for conservation at the intersection of industry and the environment. Decommissioning California's platforms is a great example of this. So I'm honored to be here today to give you a quick overview before we have great conversations and questions answered by our panelists. California has 27 offshore oil and gas platforms. Many of these platforms have been offshore for decades, extracting oil and gas. Maybe you've even seen them on your drive along the one ranging from just off Long Beach to north of Santa Barbara. However, as our blue economy shifts away from oil and gas and towards renewable, the decommissioning of these platforms is imminent and has already really begun here in California. This map shows the platforms indicated by little triangles, and the red are inactive platforms and the black are active. The dashed line represents our state water boundary. It's 3 nautical miles offshore. And as you can see, we have we have 4 platforms in state waters, 1 that is inactive, and the remainder are in federal waters, although they are very close to our state boundary. Over the past couple of years, these platforms have become increasingly inactive. We currently have 17 inactive platforms. And what that really shows us is that decommissioning is on its way. On many of these platforms, plugging and abandoning of the wells is already being underdone, and the decommissioning of that platform jacket will soon undergo Environmental Quality Act reviews and processes to determine the best decommissioning alternative for the platforms. Decommissioning is a complex technical process that involves sealing and capping the oil wells to ensure that there are no more leaks or spills. And the oil companies actually retain liability for those wells in perpetuity, so should there ever be a leak or a spill, they'll always be responsible. The removal of the platform jackets here in California will be some of the most challenging removals ever done because these platforms are some of the deepest. They range from shallower than 100 feet to deeper than 1,200. Our platforms are also very large. We have a lot of complexity, so removing these structures will be costly, as Gary mentioned, as well as present some technical challenges. Now, these challenges become even greater when we look below the surface, and we see that in California, these platforms have become important fisheries habitat. Beams and cross beams are covered in life. We see scallops and anemones, schools of jack mackerel, and even our state saltwater fish, the Garibaldi, that nest and make their permanent home on these platforms. So the ecosystems, while beautiful, that have developed on these platforms have complicated decommissioning. In fact, recent studies that have looked at these platforms, they've been researched for going on 30 years now, have found that they're some of the most productive habitats on the planet. Rigstar Reef is this idea that a platform could be modified by the oil operator to continue to support marine life as an artificial reef. Rigstar Reef is a potential alternative. It's something that would help to preserve the marine life that's associated with these structures. Through a Rigstar Reef decommissioning alternative, the wells would be sealed and capped, and the topside, or what you see from your beach chair, would be removed. But it's that platform jacket, the scaffolding that is left in the water column, that could be modified. Either the upper 80 feet removed to allow for ships to safely draft over, which is likely what would be a potential option here in California. But in other areas, they tow these platforms to areas of ecosystem need or even topple it on its side. Ultimately, the purpose of reefing a platform is to preserve the marine life that's been established there and create artificial reefs. BSEE, which stands for the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, it's one of our federal regulators for offshore resources, continues to support and encourage the reuse of these platforms as artificial reef material. However, just because the federal government is in support, we really need to have buy-in from the state, and there needs to be a lot of collaboration if a reefing alternative is to be accepted. So in California, back in 2010, former Governor Schwarzenegger signed in the California Marine Resource Legacy Act, or Assembly Bill 2503. The purpose of this bill was to allow for decommissioning alternatives such as reefing to be implemented here in the state. It put in some great boundaries for ensuring that these structures were viable reef ecosystems, providing essential fish habitat. And they even put in a clause that would allow for the cost savings, a significant portion, between 65 to 85%, to come back to the state into an endowment for marine preservation and conservation. However, one of the hurdles of this law is that it didn't address the liability for that platform jacket. So we're not sure if that liability would go to the state or if the oil companies would retain it. And therefore, this is one of the hurdles that has resulted in 0 of California's platforms being reefed. But there are also some negative impacts of reefing and some cons that we need to look at here, because it's not necessarily a good alternative for every platform. Each platform needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. One of the first hurdles we see is that legislative hurdle. How will the liability of this platform jacket and who retains it, how is that going to impact our state? There's also the spread of invasive species. So here, this picture shows the commonly known red rust bryozoan, which is an invasive here in California, and it has been found on our platforms. And they've studied invasives in the Gulf of Mexico. And what they've found is, well, the platforms do act as stepping stones for invasive species. They're not spreading them at a rate that's any greater than our natural reefs. Another con we see is a potential for greenwashing. So having these oil companies say that, okay, we're going to save money by reefing, and are they truly doing something that's going to benefit the environment? So it's really important that the industry understand that we have to look at these platforms and the ecosystem value that they would provide into the future. Lastly, and an important consideration is how leaving these structures in place will obstruct the seafloor and potentially create conflicts with other ocean users, such as trawl fishermen or others that would like to have access to that ocean bottom. A few of the pros include the ecological benefits, or the potential for these structures to provide and continue to provide those ecosystem services that have been studied over the past decade or so, a couple decades. And this is especially important as we see that a lot of our nearshore reefs here in California are being degraded by runoff pollution, overfishing. Many species are moving offshore and making their permanent home on these platforms. In fact, in California, they provide most of the breeding ground habitat for rockfish, which is an important commercial species here. Another important consideration is the pollution associated with decommissioning these platforms. Some of them are the size of the Empire State Building, and California actually doesn't have the infrastructure on shore to properly recycle them. As a result, if completely removed, they would have to be placed on the back of a barge and sent to another area to be dismantled and recycled, perhaps down to Mexico or even across the Pacific to Southeast Asia. The second that these barges go outside of state waters, they shift from diesel to bunker fuel, and bunker fuel makes diesel look like champagne. It just has a significant carbon footprint associated with it, so if we could find ways to reduce that air pollution by repurposing some of this material locally, that could be a potential pro. Another pro is the financial benefits. As you can imagine, if a portion of this platform is left in the water column, there's going to be considerable cost savings. In fact, if 23 of our 27 platforms, so we have 23 federal platforms, if those platforms were reefed, there would be a total $1 billion in saved cost. And 65, if we use our AB 2503 bill, 65% of that, or up to 85% of that, would come back to the state of California. So 650 to 850 million to the state to fund Department of Fish and Wildlife and other state-run ocean conservation initiatives. But California isn't the only place that has this problem, so we're going to take a quick look around the world. The red and blue represent oil and gas fields. As you can see, these fields are highly concentrated along the shoreline and offshore. And in fact, in every ocean, we are actively drilling for offshore oil and gas resources. So with all this offshore development, you would think that maybe a Rigstar Reef idea or alternative would be widely accepted, but that's not the case. There are only a few places that have a Rigstar Reef program. The first is here in our home state of California, and although we have AB 2503, none of our platforms have been reefed up to this point. In California, we're fortunate that there's been a lot of research on these platforms to understand the ecological value of them. That's really important and a critical component to any reefing consideration is, are these platforms viable reef habitats? And additionally, who will retain liability for that platform jacket once it's been reefed? We can look to areas like the Gulf of Mexico, where the majority of their reef platforms are managed by states of Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, in their departments of Fish and Wildlife. They've opened up their own Rigstar Reef programs within those departments. And in fact, they manage over 500 reef platforms. They've been actively reefing platforms for over 30 years. Over in Southeast Asia, we see a couple other examples of reusing these platforms, including off the coast of Brunei, where a private investor has repurposed this structure for ecotourism. They retrofitted the topside, allowing for tourists to come and stay aboard the platform, and then they can dive at the platform reef and the surrounding reefs. Another area is in the South China Sea, as well as in the Gulf of Thailand, where they have just implemented and approved their first reefing of a platform. Now, this was after 10 years of negotiation between the state, the oil company, and other stakeholders, including the fishermen and recreational and commercial fishermen that rely on the fisheries resources in the Gulf of Thailand. Our last stop will be off the coast of Gabon, where Dr. Enrique Sala, a National Geographic photographer, went and dove on these platforms. And what he found is while the surrounding areas were being decimated really by overfishing and trawling, these platforms were hotspots for life. And his research got those platforms incorporated into Africa's largest marine park. But now back to California. I want to draw our attention to a recently released Senate Bill 953, Save Our Shores Act, which was presented in response to the recent pipeline leak in the Beta field. This is an important act that's being led by Senator Min that addresses marine conservation by revising some of the legal framework. It calls for termination of state leases after 2024. And it also calls for an economic study to be completed before December 2023 to look at how terminating state leases for offshore oil and gas development is going to impact the state. So this is a really important bill. It's already seen a couple of changes. It hasn't yet been implemented, but it's good to keep an eye on this and keep it in the back of our heads for our conversations today. Looking ahead to the future of California's platforms, will they be removed or reefed? Could they be recycled for industry, or will we remain at a continued standstill? Leave that up to everyone to discuss and talk about today. Feel free to contact me with any questions. My email is amber@bluelatitudes.org. You can also follow us on social media or check out our website, and thank you very much.